There are a couple of ideas about what lines are, and they have to do with how a line is made. The first idea has to do with points. A point is a unit or individual detail that anticipates movement. According to this thought, a line is constructed by lining up an infinite series of points. The other idea also deals with points, but in this case it is a single point that is put in motion. Think of it like a pen that touches a piece of paper and then is drawn across the surface. However it is made, a line is usually made visible by the fact that it contrasts in value with the surface on which it is drawn. An outline is usually uniform in thickness and consistent in speed of application. It tells us the shape of a form. Maps that show boundaries use outlines to let the viewer know where one landform ends and another begins. Some of these are actual geographic changes, such as lakes or rivers. Others are conceptual. They don't really exist except as agreed upon borders, like the limitations of a country. Some artists use outline, as can be seen in graffiti artist Keith Haring. Haring is interested in line as descriptive. It just surrounds a shape to tell us where one shape ends and another begins. We can then determine what the shape represents. In this work, it is a mother holding a child. Contour lines can easily be confused with outlines. The main difference is that contour lines penetrate the forms they are describing. Once again, using maps as an example, a contour line would go beyond telling us the border of an area, but would also overlap that area. In this case, it is topographic, meaning that the lines tell us the three-dimensional volume of the area. In computer-aided design, such lines are often used in the same way. This helps a manufacturer to see the shape from all sides and tells computer-aided production equipment the exact specifications of the product. Artists use contour line drawings as finished pieces, rough drafts, or preliminary drawings for sculpting, painting, or printmaking. This is a quick sketch I did of my kitchen. Notice that dimensional space can be implied, but contour lines can also denote changes in things such as value. Line thickness can vary as well to express speed, emotion, volume, or any other number of differences. The sculptor Alexander Calder is using wire as a contour line in this portrait. And Raoul Dufy often uses contour lines to give his loose color paintings definition. Gesture lines are most frequently used regarding the human form. We use the word gesture oftentimes to talk about direction, as in, he gestured towards the window. In this instance, we don't know if the man pointed or nodded towards the window, but we know he moved his body somehow. In the same way, gesture drawing denotes the movement of the human form. In this image, Rembrandt is showing us the movement of an ice skater. Notice the looseness of the lines, the diagonals and curves that suggest both the direction and how the skater has to shift his weight to maintain his balance. In his sketch for the abduction of Ganymede, Rembrandt has even less definition of the figures. Notice, too, that the gestural lines are applied to the bird. There is a lot of implied movement as the child curls up and kicks out with his feet, and the dramatic movement of the almost completely abstracted figures below. Almost the only thing we know about them is their expression through their movement. That is what gesture is about. Here he uses gesture to suggest a strong wind blowing through some trees. The branches curl back against the unseen force. Sculptors also use gesture. In this case, there is a coiled and melted effect given to a metal wood screw. The artist has given a sense of movement to a form that would otherwise not have it. When we think of this object, we know that it has to be straight in order to go into the wood. When we see that it is not, we focus on the bending sensation, which is entirely out of place. But gesture lines do not have to be applied to real objects. They can just be lines that do not reference anything else. The artist Wallace Kandinsky uses gesture lines that do not reference anything. Actually, in this case, he's attempting to suggest music. The speed and intensity of sound is interpreted through his use of line. Sometimes lines are not drawn out at all, but they are still there. This is actually how we typically see lines. We don't walk along a path one day and see a line just sitting there. Lines for us typically manifest themselves as edges. The painter Edward Hopper often exaggerates such edges. In his painting Nighthawks, Hopper uses value and color changes to give us sharp outlines between forms. This can also apply to abstract work, where color and value are not tied to real things, but we can still tell one shape from another by seeing how their edges interact. There is no actual line, but we can still tell the shapes apart. In architecture, as in nature, we can tell where one form ends and another begins because they all have their own edge. In Wells Cathedral, the scissor arch serves as the end of one space and the beginning of another. Not only are most lines not drawn out, most are not even complete. We all have a strong desire to finish incomplete forms, and so we mentally complete lines. Probably the most famous implied line in the history of art is found in the creation of Adam scene on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, painted by Michelangelo. Here, God is about to impart life to Adam, the first man. The line that extends along both of the figures culminates in their untouched fingers. They are almost touching, so it takes little imagination to know that they are about to touch. They are not touching yet, so we visually complete the connection. It takes a little bit more observation to find the hidden geometry of Masaccio's painting, Holy Trinity. There are several triangles implied in the piece, all of which, of course, allude to the Trinity. But they are made by various means, such as edges or gestures. Even in non-objective work, lines can be implied. Here, there are diagonal lines that are perceptible because of the many edges that align to make them. As humans, we have a tendency to follow the gaze of others to see what they are looking at. If we see someone staring intently up at the sky, for example, we have an urge to find out what's up there. Artists and designers have understood this for millennia. In this painting of Mary, Jesus, and John the Baptist, the Renaissance artist Raphael uses the lines of sight of all three figures to move our eye around the triangular composition as Mary looks at John, John looks at Jesus, and Jesus looks back at John. In medieval icons, the painter has the figures stare right back out at the viewer. This establishes a point of connection between the holy figure and the worshipper. The line of sight travels out from the image into the real world, and if you look back at the image, the line of sight travels back into the image. Lines can be oriented in three ways: horizontal, vertical, or diagonal. Horizontal lines are restive. They suggest the horizon and things lying down. They mimic stable things and forms that are no longer active. Vertical lines are assertive. They suggest human figures standing against the pull of gravity. They are also stable because they lack movement and refer to things like trees and buildings that tend to stay where they are. Diagonal lines, however, seem temporary. They refer to things that are moving or things that are unstable. Early Christian churches tended to emphasize horizontal lines that slowly drew you to the altar. Gothic cathedrals emphasized vertical lines to draw your eyes heavenward and give you a sense of awe. Diagonal lines, as was mentioned, imply movement, even if they are implied. Here is another example of implied diagonal lines emphasizing movement. Artist Thomas Hart Benton is known for exaggerating the organic quality of his lines to give his scenes of Midwestern life and experience dynamism and drama. This plays up the life that pulsates through the land and the figures. Geometric lines are marked by a straight or mathematically defined course, as those used to define simple geometric shapes like squares, circles, or triangles. They are more restive even if they are diagonal. These types of lines are usually man-made and suggest rational thought rather than organic growth. When they do employ movement, that movement is mechanical, straight, and of even velocity. Paying attention to movement is the main determining factor between static and dynamic lines. Static in this case simply refers to a lack of movement, whereas dynamic refers to action. Dynamic lines suggest movement, instability, or flow. Usually they are diagonal or organic. The artist Nicolas Poussin uses a geometric structure and only a few diagonals to give his figures a static feeling. He also borrowed the poses from Greek marble statues to help reinforce that feeling of stability. On the other hand, the artist Rubens uses strong diagonals and lots of curving and flowing lines to convey the action of raising the cross to a vertical position. The cross and Christ with it are not in a vertical position as is typically portrayed, but instead Rubens shows the lifting at almost the midpoint, halfway up. This is why the diagonal lines exhibit such force. When the artist Albrecht Dürer heard of a rhinoceros, he became fascinated. Being from Northern Europe, he never had the occasion to go to Africa himself to see one, but relied on a written description. This is the result. First of all, it must be noted the high level of accuracy he was able to obtain from a written description. But secondly, his inability to actually see a rhinoceros led to his free play of textures to try to capture the feeling of one. So he uses line to suggest a shell-like armor, a tough, leathery, almost scaly feeling, a bony plate and horn, and some hair. This is a sketch I did of a pile of firewood sitting in my backyard. To capture the various textures, I used a variety of lines. For the wooden fence, I used slow and slightly wavy vertical lines. For the rough bark, I relied on short directional hatch marks. For the grass, I relied on repeated curves, and the other plants were simply outlined. The post-impressionist painter Vincent van Gogh not only used lines to give the impression of texture, but since he was using oil paint, his lines actually have texture. He thickly applied the paint and pushed hard with his brush to physically dig into the paint. But repeated lines do not automatically suggest texture. Another use of repeated lines is to form pattern. The ancient Greeks went through a century-long fascination with geometric lines and covered their vases with their repeated use. These lines are purely decorative and have no tactile quality. Similarly, the painter Mondrian is not interested in how his lines feel to the touch, but is attempting to form an interesting, purely visual pattern to give a pleasing sense of order to his work. Value for artists and designers refers to light and shadow, and lines have been used for centuries to convey this. Rembrandt was well known both as a painter and a printmaker. As a printmaker, he used a process known as etching. In etching, the artist carves a line into a metal plate which is then filled with ink and pressed onto paper, transferring the ink in the groove to the paper. Rembrandt uses many different approaches to value, but the main two are hatching and cross-hatching. Hatching uses parallel lines. The darker the shadow, the closer the lines are placed. In cross-hatching, parallel lines converge in a perpendicular axis with other parallel lines. Again, the deeper the shadow, the closer the lines are to each other. In this way, lines can be used to achieve the whole range of values, from the white of the page to the pure black of the ink. Artists don't always use hatching or cross-hatching to denote value. Here's one of my sketches. I am using some hatching, but I am also using other, more organic lines to capture not just the value, but the texture of the objects. There is, therefore, no right way to use lines to show value. It is up to the artist to capture just which lines best reflect the needs of the object.